this is going to be early results on the pandemic. It is very much battlefield social science, by which I mean many of these things may not hold up in the fullness of time, but we're doing what we can in a situation in which the situation on the ground is changing very, very quickly. I'm going to be talking about three things here. Just first of all, setting the stage with talking about how the scope of the pandemic shock to our economy and to our transportation system. I'm going to first highlight the extent to which our service economy is extraordinarily vulnerable to a shock that makes face-to-face contact a source of peril rather than pleasure. Secondly, I'm going to show just a little bit of facts about how big the shock to the transportation sector has been, and differentiate between some different parts of the transportation sector. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the prognosis for businesses reopening when the lockdowns end. To what extent do we think that the shutting down of our economy is something that's regulatory, that will just end when we flip a switch? And to what extent do we think that this will linger with us for months or even years to come? Then I will focus on two very specific transportation questions. The first of which is, can we ever make people feel safe again on public transit systems? I'm going to talk a little bit both on the evidence, on the linkages between public transit and the spread of COVID-19, and secondly, talk about a little bit of the ideas that people put forward to try and make people feel safe again on buses and trains. And finally, I'm going to end by discussing, in some sense, the most, existential issue, which is to what extent is COVID-19 a fundamental threat for our urban world, right? To what extent does this thing mean that we're going to move to remote working from whatever sylvan space makes us feel safe? So before COVID-19, people have been predicting that technology would make cities and face-to-face contact obsolete. It didn't, but maybe it will now. Okay, so starting with the broad arc of our employment history, if we think about the past 150 years, America has moved from farms to factories to urban service workers. Right? And that movement has in some sense left us at a place of extraordinary vulnerability to this form of pandemic. This movement has been created in part by the role of capital deepening, of mechanization, which has displaced factory workers, many of whom have moved first to low-wage areas across the planet, but also just been replaced by machines. But the one thing that a less skilled American could do that still remained, any place you had a city, any place you had wealthy customers, was to serve a latte with a smile, was to do something in the service economy where people would be willing to pay a little bit extra for a pleasant human experience. That is 32 million American workers at this point in time. That is 1/5 of the American labor force in leisure and hospitality and retail trade. And that is 1/5 of the American economy, for which, if we view the presence of a stranger serving us a coffee as a threat rather than as being a desirable thing, they can be mechanized fairly easily. And most of us have completely given up on those experiences. This just shows employment since 2000. The blue line shows the manufacturing declines, which you can see is now the lowest of these 5 sectors that I show here. Yellow is showing the rising employment in leisure and hospitality. The mid-blue line is retail trade. The orange line is professional and business services, which is the sort of higher end stuff that is zooming its way to some form of continuing employment. And the top green line is education and health services, almost assuredly the most robust of these sectors, in part because it's paid for the government. So it's these middle 2 lines that are the backbone of employment for many less skilled Americans, and it's the one that's under threat. Before the pandemic, I in fact had worried more about joblessness in the Eastern Heartland, joblessness in Central America, where those urban service jobs were not existing. And this shows the probability of not working for prime-age males. In many parts of this Eastern Heartland, you had more than 1 1/4 of prime-age males not working. And I had argued that one of the fundamental issues with these jobs is they didn't have the demand for these urban services that were employing mid-skilled people in the coastal cities. Looking forward, does this suggest that our urban areas are going to have employment problems like that of Appalachia if those service jobs disappear? But of course, the service sector workers are on the front line. So this is across New York City zip codes. This is the share of workers in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade. And it's showing you the per capita deaths at the zip code level across New York City zip code. So this is a highly predictive variable in terms of explaining which neighborhoods in New York have seen the most deaths from COVID-19. The scale of the shock has been enormous, partially because of the vulnerability of these urban services. We've seen a rise in unemployment that's not really been seen since the Great Depression. And the sort of twin shocks at this point in time of the health shock and the economic shock are facing us going forward. This comes from a survey that Michael Luca, Zoe Cullen, Alex Bartik, Marion Bertrand, Chris Stanton, and I have been doing using the alignable network of small businesses. And this is data from about April 2020. So these are businesses under 500. It's broadly nationally representative. Our data, 53% of the retailers in those businesses were closed. 70% in arts and entertainment were closed. Overall, 45% of those businesses were closed. So just an amazing shutting down of the American economy. Somewhat shockingly, fairly large numbers expect to remain closed as of December. And that, when we experimentally varied how long we told them that the crisis would last, their probability of remaining open dropped sharply as the COVID crisis became longer. The data actually does pretty well. It does a good job of actually predicting unemployment. So this is our share closed as of May 9. And we're relating this to the official data at the county level on unemployment rates in April. And as you can see, there's a fair amount of signal there in terms of predicting unemployment. So the alignable network survey is actually doing a reasonable job of capturing the extent of economic distress at the local level. Along with the shutdown, of course, has been a complete shutdown in many parts of passenger travel. So this comes from D.O.T, and Diana, thank you for this. This is person throughput at all airports. You can see it's just, radically decreasing over this time period. Just our airports have now become wastelands relative to busy thoroughfares. This comes from Stephen Poftak, the general manager of the NBTA. This is weekday ridership by line and mode. And you can find March 12th is in the middle of there, right as we're shutting down, Jim. We're right in that middle point over here. And this decline that happened incredibly quickly between March 10th and March 24th. Notice that it occurred before the shutdown of non-essential businesses. So one question going forward is the extent to which, if we just turn things around, will that cause things to be open? Certainly the shutdown happened before this. Freight declines by far less than passengers. Now, that shouldn't surprise us. Our ports have not declined at all, at least according to this. Local trucks are down a bit. Rail carloads are down a lot. This is, again, thanks to D.O.T and Diana. But freight has changed less than passengers. And that's actually an important message for lockdowns in the developing world, where some countries like Uganda actually shut down freight as well as passenger travel and saw huge dislocations as a result of that because the food couldn't get through. But so one part of our transportation network has seen a much larger change than another. One of the nice things is we now have an amazing amount of cell phone data, which is coming from different sources. This actually comes from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, the Maryland Transportation Institute. These are changes in trips and trip lengths. As measured by cell phone mobility. And there are a variety of different forms that this is coming in. SafeGraph has made their data publicly available, and many researchers, including us, have taken advantage of that, which is terrific. You can see in the top left-hand corner, the share of the population staying at home rose from 20% to 30%. Interestingly, that has started to change. So you've really seen that start to come back as of late May. So people are moving somewhat. Right below it, right to the right of it is the number of short trips. And you can see where these trips are increasing, that in the comeback. You can see first the decline, but gradually there's been a comeback, particularly of those trips that are less than 1 mile. So people going, grocery stores, people taking care of necessary items. Long trips, which is down in the lower left quarter of this, they have been slower to come back. And of course, in the last remaining one, you can see some of the heterogeneity across metropolitan areas. Some areas really have stayed down much lower than other areas have. And we'll come back to some of that later. Many researchers associated with this program have been doing great work on this. And sometimes it's been work that's specifically on COVID-19 and transport, and sometimes it's using COVID-19 to figure out things like, can we figure out better how congestion slows down our roads? So this was given to me by Gilles Danton and Matthew Turner, who's going to be speaking shortly. This shows the changes in the speeds at 2-hour intervals pre and post-COVID. So this shows October, April, and May. Not a lot of difference in most of their, in the 3 cities they have between April and May. Miami is starting to show a little bit of more congestion actually in May. So you're seeing a little bit more driving in Florida. But you can see the quite visible changes in terms of speeds that you could actually move around our roads. So it turns out pandemic is one way to actually solve the problem of America's congestion. It's a pretty terrible solution for it. And obviously we need to continue working on things like better congestion pricing models to actually solve this in a way that's less problematic. But you can use this in order to figure out what's particularly as traffic levels continue to rise, you can use it to re-estimate the elasticity of speeds with respect to the amount of congestion on the road. This shows, again, from Gilles and Matthew's work, the difference between speeds between 2 a.m. and 4 to 6 p.m. Before the pandemic, pre-COVID are the block lines, post-pandemic are the dotted lines. You know, again, these differences have become much smaller. So previously, of course, there were huge differences between nighttime speeds and afternoon speeds. Now there really isn't. And again, you see some cities, LA and Florida, some of that's coming back up. Using, again, the BTS data, you can get another way of looking at the heterogeneity and the decline of driving. These are all the counties in the US, and green is micropolitan, black is metro core, blue is suburbs, and the dotted lines are non-core. Interestingly, some of those non-core areas have actually seen increases in the number of trips. Presumably that's relocation to low density area of previously former urbanites, but they may just not be changing their driving patterns very often. But you could see also that the more educated parts of America have been the ones that have had the sharpest declines in the number of trips. And that's also a message that comes out in the work that Victor Couture, Jonathan Dingel, Jesse Handbury, and 2 other co-authors have been doing. This is looking at block groups. This is in Philadelphia. They're calling this a device exposure measure, but again, this is a measure of how much mobility there is in terms of the cell phones. And you can see prior to the strike of COVID, much more mobility on the part of the college-educated people. And of course, that's true for many of the people who are in this conference, that this is education and mobility go together in the US in many ways. Post-COVID, if anything, you can see that it flips. That in fact, educated people have seen their movement drop most. And it's been the people with less resources who have continued to use our transportation networks. And of course, many of our public transit has been particularly vital for the medical professionals. So when you talk to Steve Poftak at MBTA, he talks particularly about the peaks that are associated with people going to the Mass General and the other hospitals in Boston. This is a new thing that I saw actually today on the NBER website. Transportation is constantly going on at the NBER, apparently. This is working paper 27235, which shows small but not massive impacts on reopening on mobility. So slight increases, but not a massive reopening. This uses the state-to-state variation when reopening orders occurred. So I think all of these things cast a common message that suggests that the reopening is going to be slow, and the view that you're going to flip the switch is very unlikely to be correct. Now, finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about reopening businesses as well as mobility. And the first thing when you just look at, and this comes again from our alignable network data, is that per capita COVID cases predict which areas are closed pretty well. So the areas with low COVID cases are much more likely to be open. The areas with high COVID cases are much more likely to be closed. But it turns out that much of this is driven not by fear of COVID per se, but rather by the lockdowns that people are experiencing. So the high COVID areas are also those ones that actually had the most regulation. And one question is whether or not health concerns going forward will slow people from reopening, or whether or not there will be other factors that will deter reopening of small businesses. So this is the result. We asked people how long they think they will reopen and how long they think it'll take until the restrictions on their businesses are fully lifted. Almost every state in the union has about an average 2-week gap on average between expected reopening and restrictions being lifted. Obviously, that's not uniform across businesses. There are plenty of businesses who say they're going to be open the day after the restrictions lift. But there's certainly not a lot of correlation between places with higher levels of COVID in that gap. So think about the gap as being the extra hesitation that's being explained. And really, there's not a lot about health differences that explain that gap. So it doesn't look like businesses are being particularly wary about reopening because of the health concerns. However, they're still being somewhat wary about reopening. And it turns out the variable which does a much better job of predicting it is the widespread belief that demand for their business is likely to be radically down. So these are the small businesses, again, from the Alignable Network. We've asked them what share of their demand are they going to get of pre-COVID levels of demand at months in the future. And so 0.37 means on average, arts, entertainment, and recreation think that there's 63% less demand for their services than there were pre-COVID. Finance, insurance, they think there's only 34% less for their demand relative to pre-COVID. The first column just shows the share of businesses that think that they're roughly at 90% of what their demand was or more. Now, normally I would have thought an 8% drop in demand would be pretty big for a business. It turns out almost none of them think they'll be at 90% or higher, anytime soon. Finance and insurance is the cluster where we think that that's, they're most likely. But again, even the finance and insurance firms in our sample, only 27% of them think that they'll be over 90% by September. And many of the other businesses are, predicting much, much lower levels than that. So arts, entertainment, recreation think that 45% of their demand is going to be off by September. So these are really radical expectations about the shock to American demand, at least, for the foreseeable future. And of course, this correlates fairly strongly with demand reopening. So this is just the correlation in the data. We're just grouping them by the expected share of similar businesses to them that they say will be open. And then we're just showing the level of pre-COVID demand. And so the areas that have sort of very high levels of pre-COVID of reopening are those ones that expect high levels of consumers to return. So demand is really driving. We also have some more experimental methods to actually tease out what the elasticity is of reopening with respect to future demand. And we can find basically all of the delay is explained by, all the delay post-regulation is explained by expected shortfalls in demand going forward. And that's obviously particularly acute in those industries like the arts and entertainment where the continuing health risks are probably there. Okay, so let me pivot to the next two questions. So the first of which is, can we make public transportation safe again? So Jeff Harris had a deeply provocative and absolutely fascinating NBER working paper, maybe more than a month ago, on the role that public transportation in New York played to spread COVID. That has elicited sort of a huge amount of back and forth, but unquestionably it is a deeply plausible hypothesis. And one that, it's really going to be crucial to understand the safety of public transportation going forward. I'm going to give a little bit of what I think is the available evidence on this. Do we know how to make public transportation safe? I think the answer is right now, we're not too sure about that. And then third, because I was asked, I'm going to say a little bit of something about D.O.T's role, D.O.T's role in certifying public transportation. I will do my best to avoid saying anything of that's a policy recommendation on that, but I may veer over, in which case Jim will bleep me out, so I don't violate it. So are fears of public transportation, out there? For sure. So this is a Suffolk poll. This was again given to me by Steve Poftak at the MBTA. Would you be comfortable riding buses, subways, and commuter trains when it is allowed? This was a poll of people in Massachusetts. 79.2% said no. Okay, so 80% of Massachusetts residents said they would not be comfortable riding in public transportation. How about if you have an effective treatment but not a vaccine for COVID? Well, then only 57% said no. Okay, so that's a pretty huge number still of people feeling uncomfortable. Even if you got a vaccine, 25% said no. So short of a vaccine, it looks like this is going to be a huge problem with getting people to take public transit going forward. And this, of course, turns not only into a shock for the public transit systems, for cities like Boston, where public transit is a major part of our transportation network. If they're not taking public transit, then our roads become even more impassable. Right? In the case of New York, it's just impossible to imagine how people are going to get around without public transit. And if fear of public transit is that widespread, then this is going to help fuel, and that's what I'm going to talk to in the third section. A large exodus for at least some from from urban areas. Now, what do we know about public transit and mortality? So this shows across counties. There's also a nice NBER working paper from Klaus Desmet and Romain Worczak on looking at the cross-US prevalence of COVID. I've got cases on one side, deaths on the other side. The elasticity with respect to population is just because I have total cases, not deaths, not cases per capita. So you're looking for a number about 1 over there, which is what you see in the cases. Deaths, it's lower. The density measure in the first column just shows this fact that cities do tend to have tended to have higher levels of COVID-19. And that's true. These regressions actually don't include the 5 boroughs of New York. It's true certainly if you control for proximity to New York as well. The next column shows what you get when you throw in share using public transit. And these numbers are really quite large. You're getting a very big impact. So if you want to interpret the elasticity in pseudo percentage terms, a 10 percentage point increase in the share of the population using public transit is associated with a 35% increase in cases per capita. Now, I should say which parts of the US are driving that. It's counties around New York. So it's parts of Long Island. It's the areas that are near New York, but it's also Detroit. So there also are cities in the American heartland where public transit use is high and COVID cases are higher. You can kill some of it with other controls. So it is a fact that share African American is strongly positively associated with both cases and deaths from COVID. This is obviously not just about diagnosis, because you see in columns 3 through 6, you see the same fact in terms of deaths. And so in both of them, public transit is strongly associated with COVID deaths. And this is just what cases per capita and public transit share looks like among larger, more populous counties in the US. That's what the scattergram looks like. This is what it looks like in terms of the deaths per capita. Another fact which is quite interesting, this work is by a PhD student of ours at Harvard, Karen Shen. The thing I want you to focus on is this second column, which is the tract where the staff of nursing homes live, the public transit use in those tracts. And this is looking at nursing home deaths and public transit use in the tracts where the nursing home attendants live. Is associated with more deaths. You can, in fact, kill this off with enough controls. It's not totally robust, but it is certainly true that if you think sort of from a national policy failure, the area in which we've clearly failed most is to protect our nursing homes. 60% of Massachusetts deaths are in nursing homes, and sort of paying attention to both, to the staff and the environments in which they're living and the environments that they're getting to the nursing homes seems like a thing of first order importance. I should say it's not at all obvious if this is because the staff themselves are using public transit. We know, for example, that most of them overwhelmingly are not. So it would have to be something else about the tract environments in which they live that are likely to be causing this correlation. Now, second fact, and this is joint work with Erica Muskowski and John Teebs. Across New York City zip codes, there is no positive correlation between public transit usage and COVID cases and deaths at all, okay? If anything, it often goes the wrong way, as it does in the third column. So there's no sense in which zip codes within New York City, public transit seems to be associated with COVID. So the place where Jeff Harris started us on, I didn't see anything in the public transit usage data to support this. Now and this is just what it looks like. So if you don't control for anything else, you get a very flat line. But it creates a question. So why does public transit predict COVID across cities, but not within New York City? I think there are 2 possible explanations. One of which is that public transit doesn't actually spread COVID at all. It's correlated with other county-level attributes like pre-existing health conditions that generate vulnerability to COVID-19. Entirely possible. 2, public transit correlation within cities is compromised by the endogenous responsive areas where people used to take public transit pre-COVID. So it's much more the case that you can imagine to see that behavioral response at the neighborhood level, where public transit usage may be correlated with lots of other things, than you would necessarily across metropolitan areas. So if the areas with more public transit shut down more, then this can explain the non-correlation. So let me just show you some maps of New York. And again, thank you to Caitlin for putting this together. So this is cases per capita. Within the 5 boroughs of New York, I've cut off a little bit of Staten Island on the left-hand side, and it's fraction public transportation use. So in some parts, there is a correlation, but it's also related to poverty, meaning that sort of if you look at the upper reaches of Manhattan, those are relatively high COVID use areas, and they're relatively case areas, and those are relatively high public transit areas. But look at the Brooklyn, Queens areas. They're the areas that have by far the most public transit usage, meaning the areas that are close to Manhattan have by far the least cases. Okay, that's exactly what, and that's what's driving the New York City non-correlation, is that all of these sort of core areas of Brooklyn, right around public transit stops, have very few numbers of cases. Now, what's happened in terms of the behavioral response? Well, this is again showing you the fraction public transit again. So that's on the left-hand side over there, and there we see the change in trips by residential zip code using SafeGraph. And what you can see is, not in Manhattan, but again, focus on Brooklyn, that the areas that have the heavy public transit usage are the areas in which you see the largest behavioral response. Now, I can't separate here from this data whether or not there are people who are sheltering in place in Brooklyn or they've moved off to country homes. It's very hard to tell. But public transit within at least those boroughs of New York is associated with the ability to reduce your usage, whereas the driving areas are ones in which people have continued to move around and they've continued to get COVID. So I'll just show you this in terms of scattergrams. So this is showing the change in trips and cases per person. So the places that have the fewest changes in trips are the places that have the highest COVID cases per person. It was the adaptation, it was the shutting down across New York City zip codes that proved to be protective. Shouldn't surprise you, social distancing is actually one thing we know works against contagion. Fraction using public transit and the changes in trips, it's a negative correlation, right? So that's what turns out that's driving it, and at least that's one explanation for it. So it's not that public transportation doesn't present threats. All places in which people connect with each other potentially create threats, but at least one explanation for why it doesn't correlate in New York is that, in fact, the high public transit areas are the areas where you had the best ability to engage in behavioral responses. And, I should just say as a sidelight, the fact that economics is almost always the social science of behavioral responses suggests why economists have such a central role to play in understanding the spread of COVID, because it really is about how people respond to this threat. This is Chicago. You see a pattern that's quite similar. High public transit areas are also areas where you saw the largest drops in trips, especially on the north side, on the wealthier parts, on the Lincoln Park parts of these areas. This is change in trips on the left-hand side. This is fraction using public transit. The other one is change in trips and cases per capita. Again, low change, lots of very steep declines in changes in trip means low cases per capita in Chicago. This is the same 2 graphs for Philadelphia. You see the same basic pattern. So you saw this large behavioral response for these inner areas where people took public transit a lot, and so you saw more of a decline. Now, can we possibly make people feel safe around public transit again? I think the easiest thing is to protect their workers. So there's a fact that I think I learned from Diego Puga on the difference between Barcelona and New York City in terms of the illness of public transit workers, which was much higher in Barcelona. That at least potentially reflects the difference in the plexiglass that protects the Barcelona drivers. So that's type of thing where you just have a single worker that doesn't really need to personally interact and can be separated is sort of the easiest thing. Disinfecting the physical spaces. New York City did it every 3 days. Boston did it daily. The MBTA did it daily. I have no idea if it made a difference. The CDC has recently downgraded their views of how threatening it is to touch physical spaces as opposed to people. It's something that would be great for us to get some clarity from the epidemiologists on. Decrowding public transportation. So in the short run, this is certainly doable, although even now in peak routes, they're having trouble keeping the buses relatively empty. Turns out bus drivers have a lot of trouble saying no, and they're trying to sort of make this automatic. Turnstiles in principle can make limits automatic, but then what about large families who would be clustering together? So I think it'd be useful to get more of a sense as we go forward, and we can use the visual recognition tools that are out there to actually measure whether or not we actually have a large crowding problem or not, whether or not people are actually giving each other space. there's a lot of enthusiasm for wearing masks. Certainly, that we've tried to create a norm around face masks, but enforcing this has proven to be very difficult. I think many major public transit systems have faced ugly social media backlash, particularly when you see white officers pulling unmasked African Americans off of buses or off of trains. So you can imagine that the difficulty of infection enforcing this means that, you know, it's always going to have to depend upon sort of community enforcement and community norms. I was asked to specifically, this is not a recommendation, just be clear, Jim. I'm not actually saying certainly not. I'm just saying that it might be suboptimal in the model that I'm writing down. Should D.O.T certify public transit systems for safety from contagion? I think it's unlikely that D.O.T itself should take it on, right? Why should D.O.T make themselves liable? Why shouldn't it make it political? Keep it in the hands of scientists, you know, especially when the science is so uncertain. I think a better alternative is to actually empower private entities to bring together recognized public health authorities like hospitals and virologists, and then encourage them to create a certification program, or to encourage independent entities to start rating of a variety of different formats. And you can imagine crowdsourcing information on this. So I think actually a system that actually gets the information out there, that enables people to learn in real time how crowded various buses are, for systems to certify how good of a job they're doing at cleaning. That's all well and good, but I think it would be a mistake for D.O.T to take it on itself. D.O.T can do training, certainly, but not take it on itself to do the certification. So let me move on to the last part of it, which is in some sense the largest, which is, will this boost in remote working become permanent? And I'm going to start with a little bit of recap of the pre-COVID discussion of telecommuting and transport. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about cities and plague in the past, engage in a little bit of evidence on what people are saying about telecommuting during the pandemic, and whether or not business economists expect that this will continue. And then I'll end with some highly debatable prognostication. So over the long course of history, transportation technology has always shaped urban form. And the 20th century was a world of highly centrifugal technologies, perhaps above all the automobile, but also radios and televisions, which are, you know, a form of transportation technology of their own for moving images and voices. And this enabled the great flight of Americans and of American industry away from the dense urban areas that had enabled 19th century industrialization, that had been the nodes of the transportation network that connected America. So the rise of cars and automobiles killed off urban industry. They led to decentralization from urban cores to suburbs, as the work of Nate Baum-Snow has taught us. And this led the cyber seers and the techno prophets, when I was 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was starting out in this business, to think that these technologies, information technology of the 1980s, would lead to widespread dispersal of the information workers who remained in cities, right? Would lead to all of us doing exactly what we're doing right now and just zooming it in instead of connecting face to face. But that isn't what happened. For 30 years afterwards, finance became, if anything, more urban in its dominance, and technology companies like Google, and that's an image of Google space, invested heavily in proximity. And far from using their technology to send everyone home, they bought the Googleplex. They bought 1.5 million square feet in downtown Manhattan. They encouraged everyone to be right on top of each other because they thought this led to productivity. Because in a world in which ideas and knowledge are the most important currency, then being right on top of each other is more valuable. In a world in which ideas and concepts are more complex, then the edge of face-to-face contact becomes more valuable. And that seemed to be driving a remarkable urban renaissance in America. And you see this in terms of per capita income, and you see this in terms of population change. So America's cities came back, not despite the new technologies, but for many decades, it seemed like it was because of the new technologies that we were living in a more collaborative, more intense, more face-to-face world, and cities were enabling that. Now, that's part of the story. The other part of the story is that the urban edge in entertainment was valued. And I think that's something for us to keep in mind going forward, that cities came back not just as places of productivity, but also as places of pleasure, that the urban advantages of enabling us to share common infrastructure enabled us to go to art galleries and museums and entertainment venues. And of course, the same urban competitiveness, same urban competition and entrepreneurship that works wonders in the business space also enables the creation of new restaurants, of new sources of joy. And of course, the most important advantage of being face-to-face is just being around other human beings. And that's particularly true for younger people for whom, connecting in cyberspace is never really a perfect substitute for sharing a meal or a kiss or a smile. So what does COVID do to this? Now, it turns out plagues and cities are long companions. Right? The plague of Athens comes in 430 BC, right? So that's 2,450 years ago. The greatest urban civilization that the Western world had seen was laid low by plague because of Pericles had the clever idea that they were going to shelter behind their walls and bring in all the Attic farmers. And then they were going to send their boats out to ravage the shores of their Peloponnesian enemies in Sparta, right? Brilliant plan, except for the fact that even if the Spartans can't get into Athens' walls, plague could. And of course, the plague of Athens killed Spartacus and badly damaged that urban civilization. Flash forward 900 years, 530 AD, Justinian is trying to reboot the Roman Empire, trying to create the Pax Romana across the Mediterranean world. And plague comes. The first time the Black Death shows up in Europe, it shows up in Constantinople, and those dreams are pretty much over. And the chaos that follows that plague basically leads to a de-urbanizing of Europe for close to a millennium. So the impacts of disease can be fairly catastrophic if they then lead to knock-on effects. This is the 19th century map of death rates in New York, and you can see that sort of plague is a common companion. A boy born in New York City in 1900 was expected to live 6 years less than a boy born in rural America. That's about the same gap that existed between London and the rest of England during the time of Shakespeare. And you can see the great urban pandemics of the 19th century: yellow fever, mosquito-borne, early 19th century, cholera, mid-19th century, plague comes out of the Ganges Delta, travels across the global network of the 19th century and hits New York in 1831. Both of these were somewhat different than the plague that preceded them. So it turned out that the tools that were used against the literal Black Death, quarantine, tended to be fairly ineffective against yellow fever, partially because mosquitoes can travel even if you lock people up. Cholera, of course, is waterborne. And it wasn't until America's cities and towns spent, as much on clean water as they did at the start of the 20th century, as the federal government spent on everything except for the post office and the army, that cities started getting healthier. Now, I should stress, because this is an economics group, that this required not just engineering, but also incentives. Okay, because in fact, you can see right there, the Croton Aqueduct opened in 1842. And for 25 years after that, New Yorkers still died of cholera. And the reason for that is that poor people didn't connect. There were 1,000 free hydrants, but it wasn't enough. And so poor people continued to use their shallow wells and continue to their pit latrines, and they continue to die. And it's only when you have the Board of Health that starts imposing what are essentially Pigouvian taxes on tenement owners that forces them to adopt that you see the cholera rates going down. So that really is sort of a central message of this going forward, that we need to both, think about massive investments, but also the incentives that wrap around those investments. But the map also shows you that we've had a century of remarkable health after influenza. For almost a century, our cities have been the Western cities have been remarkably plague-free. The one major difference from that, of course, was AIDS, which was terrible. But because it was largely a sexually transmitted disease, it didn't pose the same kind of existential threat as a disease that's transmitted by droplets does. Because fundamentally, if you're afraid of meeting with another person, then the whole function of cities, eliminating the spaces between other human beings, becomes a downside. And for everyone who's sheltering in place, there is no advantage in being in an urban area, really, at this point in time. Now, we have had a number of great NBER papers that have come out on the rise of remote working. One of the more amazing pieces was by Dingel and Naiman, who used their work on very pre-COVID of how much you could do work remotely across occupations. And they used that to predict which sectors would actually see more remote working. And this is a paper that's already received 100 citations from it. And it was purely predictive. Now, the amazing thing is we went out and we used our alignable data, and we actually measured which sectors were actually doing remote working. And it turns out that Dingel and Naiman got it exactly right. that in fact the places that are doing, the places that they were predicting were going to be doing remote working are the places that are doing remote working. So you can see here that sort of food, accommodation, and agriculture are not. Education, information, finance, these are the places that are doing remote working. This comes from our National Association of Business Economists survey. And here we're asking, just a shift in remote working before COVID-19, and what of them are doing it now. And this is tending to show just a very large, so this is, 41% of those firms had less than 20% of their workers doing remote work before COVID-19. That's what the column 1 shows. 16% could do remote work before COVID-19. What share of businesses have only 1/5 of their workers or less working remotely now? Only 4%. Okay, so that's what that says. By contrast, move to the 80 to 100%. Only 27% did work remotely before COVID-19, had 80 to 100% of their workers doing that. 49% of them said they could work, that many could work remotely. Now 65% of firms are in that area. Now, we also asked them, how is the productivity of their remote workers fared? I think the best we can say that this is probably a rule of thumb kind of thing. But what that's telling you is that most of them think there's not much of a difference in terms of their productivity. Now, those of us who are defenders of the face-to-face contact can still argue that, well, their work plans were made before COVID-19. This isn't asking about the highly creative, inventive stuff that goes on. But we've all gotten better at Zoom, right? We've all gotten better working remotely, and it is certainly a live possibility going forward that many more of our tasks, maybe not the sort of most sensitive ones, but that many more of our tasks can be done remotely going forward. So this shows that the Dingel and Naiman thing also works for predicting across industries in the NABE survey as well as the liable. This asks what share of the firm's workers who did not work remotely before COVID-19 will do so when business returns to normal. So 36% say less than 1/5 of them will work remotely, but so 36% of them say that those less than 1/5 of the workers who did not work remotely will also not work remotely after. The larger percentages all show that they're expecting a larger, all the other groups say that they're expecting a larger share of people. And the firms, a fair number of them also think that the firms will be more geographically flexible going forward. So these business economists at least are predicting that they're going to see more remote working going forward. So what does this actually mean for cities? So I think, first of all, everything depends on the duration of the pandemic risk. So if this ends relatively quickly, 12 months, 9 months, and doesn't happen again, then the shock is real but doesn't change urban life massively. Still, there will be short-term shifts. So in terms of when you think about remote working, in cities like Boston or New York or San Francisco, the gap between current commercial prices, or certainly residential prices, and the price at which you start leaving space empty is so large that there's a great deal of movement of price before you see any movement of quantity, right? So you're unlikely to see large-scale vacancies in Greenwich Village anytime soon because, currently the price of a townhouse is $7 million. Even if it were to fall to $4.5 million or $2.5 million, it would still be occupied. And that's true for great swaths of coastal America. In the middle parts of America, in the St. Louis's and Cleveland's, there's more of a possibility, and there's likely to be more vulnerability in commercial space than there is in residential space. Even so, even in terms of quantities, I would expect more shuffling, and there's every reason to think that the shuffling that will occur would be a reallocation from old to young. Certainly in the US, perhaps a little bit less so in Brazil, vulnerability is strongly associated with age. I certainly have many friends, parents who've declared they are certainly never getting on public transit again. That suggests that at least some of the empty nesters who have urbanized over the past 20 years may well think that a low density home is more attractive. Certainly some significant work will move either to homes or to lower density locales. And even in the best of circumstances for cities, you'd expect to see some of sort of lower density or mid density consumer cities, places that are sort of deeply pleasant, the Vales of this world, maybe the Boulders, to do quite well out of this. Will that make our roads more or less crowded? It's not obvious, because a greater suburban dispersal actually leads to longer trips when they occur. So even some more working at home can actually make some of our road problems more difficult. So transportation is likely to have interesting shifts moving forward, and public transit is likely to be challenged for many years. And I think we should continue to expect major fiscal problems in our public transit systems for a long period to come. International travel will also surely be depressed for quite some time. And certainly when you think about clusters of the American economy, the combination of sort of the travel sector, the air travel sector, and the leisure and hospitalities are areas in which we can expect to see sort of huge issues. There are some bright spots. So certainly I believe the rental costs for mobile homes has soared in recent years. So there are some transportation and leisure technologies that have done well, but they involve a fair amount of social distancing. So what about the bad scenario? The bad scenario is that the shock doesn't end quickly, and if there are more pandemics. So this isn't the first time we had of this thing. We had SARS, we had MERS, we had an H1N1 issue in 2009. Then it seems that quite significant changes will occur in both the urban location and the demand for transportation. Now, I am not predicting that, in part because this would shatter the urban service industry. Right, 32 million American workers would be devastated by this, right, and create enormous economic dislocations. And it at least suggests that we should be willing to spend enormous sums to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Right, it does make sense to spend tens of billions to avoid a crisis that is costing trillions. What are the sensible things to be spending on? I think we don't know yet. But certainly research on transportation and safety is likely to be an important part of that, as well as research on virology, preparing situations so we have rapid vaccine production, and so forth.